The fever hit Josephine Wade like a rattlesnake strike on the third day of her journey west, and by the time the wagon train rolled into Ordway, Colorado, in late June of 1882, she was barely conscious in the back of her family's covered wagon. Her father pulled the horses to a stop outside the general store, his weathered face creased with worry as he called for help, and within minutes a crowd had gathered to peer at the young woman thrashing beneath sweat-soaked blankets. The doctor was 3 towns over, someone said, and would not return for at least a week. Josephine's mother pressed a trembling hand to her daughter's burning forehead and looked around desperately at the faces of strangers, wondering if this dusty Colorado town would be where her only child drew her last breath. Russell Palmer heard the commotion from the livery stable, where he had been shoeing horses all afternoon. At 26 years old, he had seen his share of sickness on the frontier, had watched too many good people succumb to fevers and infections that would have been treatable back east. He wiped the sweat from his brow with a bandana and walked toward the gathering, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the main street of Ordway, and Russell could see the heat shimmering off the wooden buildings that lined both sides of the wide dirt road. He pushed through the small crowd and looked into the wagon. The young woman lying there could not have been more than 22 or 23, with dark hair plastered to her pale face and lips that moved soundlessly as she fought whatever demon had seized her body. Her dress was modest and well-made, suggesting a family of some means, and Russell noticed the way her mother clutched her hand with the fierce desperation of someone who had already lost too much in this life. "How long has she been like this?" Russell asked quietly. The father turned to him, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. 3 days now. Started with chills on the trail, then the fever came on strong. We pushed hard to make it here, hoping to find a doctor. "Dr. Stevens is in Denver until next week," Russell said. He studied the young woman for a long moment, then made a decision that would alter the course of his life in ways he could not yet imagine. "Bring her to my place. I have a spare room, and it will be cooler than keeping her in this wagon under the sun. I cannot promise anything, but I know something about nursing folks through fever." The mother looked at him with suspicion and hope warring in her expression. "We do not know you, sir. Why would you take in a stranger?" Russell met her gaze steadily. "Because out here, we are all strangers until we are not. And because leaving her in this heat is as good as a death sentence. My mother was a nurse before she passed. She taught me a few things before the cholera took her." Something in his voice must have convinced them, because after a brief whispered conversation between husband and wife, they agreed. Russell helped the father carry Josephine into his small house at the edge of town, a simple structure with 2 bedrooms, a main room, and a kitchen that he had built himself 3 years earlier when he had decided to make Ordway his permanent home. The spare bedroom was small but clean, with a single window that caught the evening breeze when there was one to be had. They laid Josephine on the narrow bed, and her mother immediately began fussing with the blankets until Russell gently but firmly ushered both parents out. "She needs air, not suffocation," he said. "The fever needs to break, and that will not happen if we keep her bundled up. Trust me on this." He could see the fear in their faces, but they nodded and retreated to the main room. Russell pulled the curtains back to let in as much air as possible, then filled a basin with cool water from the pump outside. He grabbed several clean cloths from his cabinet and returned to the bedside, where Josephine had begun to shake violently despite the heat radiating from her body. Russell had no illusions about the danger she was in. He had seen strong men die from fevers like this, had helped bury neighbors and friends who had simply burned away from the inside until there was nothing left. But he had also seen people survive against all odds, and something about the way Josephine fought, even in her delirium, told him she was a fighter. He dipped one of the cloths in the cool water, wrung it out, and gently placed it on her forehead. Her skin was so hot it almost seemed to sizzle against the damp fabric. She moaned softly and turned her head, but did not wake. Russell pulled up a wooden chair and settled in beside the bed, knowing that the night ahead would be long and uncertain. The first hours passed in a blur of repetitive motions. Dip the cloth, wring it out, place it on her forehead or along her neck, where the pulse beat frantically beneath her skin. Replace the cloth when it grew warm from her fever, which happened every few minutes. Russell worked methodically, pausing only to pump more water when the basin grew tepid. Josephine's parents came to check on her every hour, bringing food that Russell barely touched and offering to take over the vigil so he could rest. He refused each time, though he could not have explained why if pressed. Something about the responsibility he had taken on when he had invited them into his home felt too important to hand off to someone else, even her own mother and father. As midnight approached, Josephine's fever seemed to spike even higher. She began to thrash in the bed, calling out words that made no sense, reaching for things only she could see in her fevered state. Russell had to hold her down gently to keep her from hurting herself, one hand on her shoulder, while the other continued to cool her brow with the damp cloth. Her skin burned against his palm, and he felt a surge of helpless anger at his own limitations. He was just a cowboy who had learned to shoe horses and mend fences, not a doctor who understood the mysteries of medicine and healing. "Hold on," he whispered to her, though he knew she could not hear him. "You are stronger than this. I can see it in you. Just hold on." Her eyes opened briefly, unfocused and glassy with fever, and for a moment their gazes met. Russell saw terror in those eyes, and confusion, and something else he could not name. Then they closed again, and she fell back into the restless sleep that was not really sleep at all. The night stretched on endlessly. Russell lost track of time, measuring the hours only by the number of times he changed the water in the basin and the slow movement of the moon across the window. His back ached from sitting in the hard chair, and his eyes burned with exhaustion. But he did not stop. He had made a promise, even if it was only to himself, and Russell Palmer was not a man who broke his word. Sometime around 3 a.m, Josephine's mother appeared in the doorway with a fresh pitcher of water and clean towels. She watched him work for a long moment before speaking. "You are a good man," she said softly. "I was wrong to doubt your intentions." Russell did not look up from his task. Any decent person would do the same. "You would be surprised how few decent people there are in this world," she replied. She set the pitcher and towels on the small table beside the bed, then touched his shoulder briefly before leaving him alone with her daughter once more. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the window, Russell noticed a subtle change in Josephine's breathing. It seemed less labored, though her fever still raged. He continued his ministrations, cooling her brow, her neck, her wrists where the veins ran close to the surface. His hands moved with a tenderness that would have surprised anyone who knew him only as the quiet, reserved cowboy who kept to himself and rarely socialized beyond what was necessary for business. The truth was that Russell Palmer had spent most of his adult life building walls around his heart. He had lost his mother to disease, his father to drink and despair, and the woman he had once thought he would marry to another man with better prospects. He had learned that caring too much only led to pain, so he had stopped caring at all. He worked, he slept, he existed, but he did not really live. Yet sitting beside this stranger's bedside, fighting to keep her tethered to this world, he felt something stir inside him that he had thought long dead. The second day of fever was somehow worse than the first. Josephine's body seemed to be consuming itself from the inside, and no matter how many cool cloths Russell applied, her temperature refused to break. Her lips cracked and bled, and he had to carefully drip water into her mouth to keep her from becoming dangerously dehydrated. Most of it ran down her chin, but some of it she swallowed reflexively, and Russell counted each swallow as a small victory. Her parents took turns sitting with him during the day, though they deferred to his judgment on her care. Her mother told him stories about Josephine while they worked together, painting a picture of a vibrant young woman who loved to read and had dreams of opening a school wherever they settled. She had been a teacher back in Missouri before they had decided to seek their fortune in Colorado, where her father hoped to establish a ranch and build a life away from the crowded cities of the East. She was so excited about this journey, her mother said, her voice breaking. She saw it as an adventure, a chance to start fresh and make her own way in the world. And now this. Russell heard the unspoken fear in those last words, and now she might die before she ever gets that chance. He redoubled his efforts, though he was so tired he could barely see straight. His hands shook slightly as he wrung out another cloth, and he had to blink several times to clear his vision. "You need to rest," Josephine's father said firmly. "You have been at this for more than a day without sleep. Let me take over for a few hours." Russell started to protest, but the older man cut him off. "I know you feel responsible, son, but you will be no good to her if you collapse from exhaustion. A few hours of sleep, that is all I'm asking. We will wake you if anything changes." The logic was sound, even though every instinct Russell possessed screamed at him to stay. He nodded reluctantly and stumbled to his own bedroom, where he fell onto the bed fully clothed. Sleep claimed him instantly, pulling him down into a dark well where he dreamed of fires that could not be extinguished and voices calling for help that he could not provide. He woke 3 hours later in a panic, his heart racing as he scrambled out of bed and rushed to the spare room. Josephine's mother was sitting beside the bed, continuing the same routine he had established, and she looked up at him with a small, sad smile. "No change," she said simply. Russell took his place beside the bed once more, noting that the sun was already past its zenith. The second day was bleeding into the second night, and still the fever held on with cruel tenacity. He resumed his work, and Josephine's mother went to rest, the two of them trading off in shifts that blurred together until Russell could no longer remember if he was awake or dreaming. The second night brought new challenges. Josephine began to convulse around midnight, her body seizing so violently that Russell had to physically hold her down to keep her from falling out of the bed. Her mother came running at the sound of his shout, and together they kept her safe until the convulsions passed, leaving her limp and barely breathing. "Is she dying?" her mother whispered, tears streaming down her face. Russell did not know how to answer that question truthfully without destroying what little hope remained. "She is fighting," he said instead. "As long as she is fighting, there is a chance." But privately he wondered if he was simply prolonging the inevitable. The fever showed no signs of breaking, and Josephine's body could only endure so much before it simply gave up. He had seen it happen before, that moment when a person stopped fighting and slipped away into the darkness. He prayed silently to a God he was not sure he believed in anymore, that he would not have to witness that moment with this young woman he did not even know. He cooled her brow through the night, his movements automatic now, a rhythm he could have maintained in his sleep. The cloth against her forehead, down her temples, along her neck, across her wrists. Over and over, an endless cycle of small, desperate acts of care that seemed meaningless in the face of such overwhelming odds. As the third day dawned, Russell felt his own strength beginning to fail. He had slept perhaps 5 hours total since Josephine had been brought to his home, had eaten only what was forced upon him by her parents, and his body was starting to rebel against the constant demands he was placing upon it. His vision blurred at the edges, and he caught himself nodding off several times, jerking awake with a start each time his chin touched his chest. But he could not stop, would not stop, because somewhere in the fog of exhaustion and repetitive motion, something had shifted inside him. This was no longer about duty or obligation, or even simple human decency. He realized with a clarity that cut through his fatigue that he could not bear the thought of losing her, this woman he had never spoken to, whose voice he had never heard except in fevered delirium. It made no logical sense, but the heart rarely dealt in logic. The afternoon of the third day brought a new crisis. Josephine's breathing became shallow and rapid, and her pulse fluttered beneath Russell's fingers like a trapped bird. Her skin took on a grayish cast that terrified him, and when he called for her parents, he saw his own fear reflected in their faces. "Should we send for a priest?" her father asked quietly. Russell wanted to rage at the suggestion, to insist that she was going to live, but he forced himself to be practical. "If it would bring you comfort, then yes, but I am not giving up on her yet." They sent for the priest, and he arrived an hour later, a young man with kind eyes who performed the last rites while Russell continued to cool Josephine's brow. The words washed over him without really registering, prayers for her soul and pleas for divine mercy. When the priest finished, he placed a hand on Russell's shoulder. "You have done more than most would," he said gently. "If she passes, it will not be for lack of trying on your part. Sometimes God calls people home, and there is nothing we can do to prevent it." "Then God will have to fight me for her," Russell said, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion, "because I am not letting her go without a fight." The priest nodded and left, and Russell was alone with Josephine once more. Her parents had retreated to the main room, unable to watch what they believed were their daughter's final hours. But Russell stayed, as he had stayed from the beginning, his hands moving mechanically through the motions of care that had become as natural as breathing. As evening approached on the third day, Russell began to talk to her. He did not know if she could hear him, but the silence had become oppressive, and he needed to fill it with something other than his own dark thoughts. "My name is Russell Palmer," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. I know we have not been properly introduced, but it seems silly to stand on ceremony now. Your mother tells me you are a teacher, that you love books and learning. I am not much of a reader myself, but I admire people who are. Takes a special kind of patience to sit with words on a page for hours on end. He paused to refresh the cloth on her forehead, then continued. I came to Ordway 3 years ago, looking for a place to put down roots. I had been drifting since my mother died, working odd jobs here and there, never staying in one place long enough to call it home. But something about this town spoke to me. Maybe it was the mountains in the distance, or the way the sky seems to go on forever. Or maybe I was just tired of running from ghosts. Josephine's breathing hitched, and Russell leaned forward anxiously, but it smoothed out again after a moment. He settled back in the chair and kept talking, finding comfort in the sound of his own voice breaking the oppressive silence. I built this house with my own hands, every board and nail. Took me 6 months, working mostly alone. Folks thought I was crazy, building a 2-bedroom house for a single man with no prospects of marriage. But I always thought that maybe someday I would have a family to fill it. Seems foolish now, that kind of hope. I had let that dream go until you showed up in that wagon, burning up with fever, and suddenly I remembered what it felt like to care about something beyond my own survival. He realized he was rambling, saying things he had never said to another living soul, but he could not seem to stop. The words poured out of him like water from a broken dam. Years of loneliness and suppressed emotion finding voice in the quiet room, with only an unconscious woman to bear witness. I do not know if you can hear me, he admitted. But if you can, I need you to know that you are not alone. I am right here, and I am not going anywhere. You fight this fever, and I will fight it with you. We will win this battle together, you and I. Just do not give up. Please, do not give up. The sun set on the 3rd day, painting the sky outside the window in shades of orange and purple that Russell barely noticed. He was beyond exhaustion now, moving through a strange state of heightened awareness where everything seemed both crystal clear and slightly unreal. His hands continued their work without conscious thought, cooling her brow, checking her pulse, dripping water between her cracked lips. Around 10 o'clock at night, as Russell was preparing himself for another endless vigil, he noticed something that made his heart leap into his throat. The cloth he had just placed on Josephine's forehead did not warm as quickly as it had before. He held his breath, afraid to hope, and counted slowly to 30 before touching the cloth again. Still damp, still cool. With shaking hands, he placed his palm against her cheek and felt a temperature that was still far too high, but noticeably lower than it had been just an hour earlier. The fever was breaking. After 3 days and 3 nights of relentless heat, her body was finally beginning to cool. Russell wanted to shout, to wake the entire household and share the news, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had seen false hopes before, fevers that seemed to break only to return with renewed vengeance. He would wait, would watch, would continue his care until he was absolutely certain that the danger had passed. Over the next 2 hours, Josephine's temperature continued to drop slowly but steadily. Her breathing eased, becoming deeper and more regular, and some of the deathly pallor left her face. Russell watched these changes with an intensity that bordered on obsession, cataloging every small improvement, every sign that she was winning the battle that had raged inside her for so long. Around midnight, Josephine's eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused at first, confusion evident in their depths as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. Her gaze wandered around the unfamiliar room before finally settling on Russell's face, and he saw the moment awareness returned to her. "Where am I?" Her voice was barely a whisper, rough from disuse and dehydration, but it was the most beautiful sound Russell had ever heard. "You are safe," he said gently. "You are in Ordway, Colorado, in my home. You have been very sick with fever for 3 days. Your parents are here as well, sleeping in the next room. Would you like me to wake them?" Josephine tried to shake her head, then winced at the movement. "Water," she managed. Russell carefully lifted her head and held a cup to her lips, supporting her with one hand while she took small sips. She drank greedily at first, and he had to pull the cup away to keep her from making herself sick. "Slowly," he cautioned. "Your stomach needs time to adjust." She nodded and took slower sips, her eyes never leaving his face. When she had drunk her fill, he lowered her head gently back to the pillow and set the cup aside. They looked at each other in the lamplight, two strangers connected by 3 days of shared struggle against death itself. "Thank you," Josephine whispered. "I remember you in the fever dreams. Your voice, your hands on my forehead, keeping the fire at bay. You saved my life." Russell felt heat rise in his cheeks, embarrassed by the gratitude in her eyes. "I only did what anyone would do." "No," she said firmly, despite her weakness. "Not anyone. Most people would have left me in that wagon to die. You took me into your home, cared for me when you had no reason to, sat beside me for days when you could have been living your own life. That is not something that anyone would do. That is something that a good man would do." Before Russell could respond, she had fallen back asleep, but it was a natural sleep this time, restful and healing rather than the fevered restlessness that had plagued her for days. Russell watched her for a long moment, his heart doing strange things in his chest that he could not fully explain. Then he rose stiffly from the chair that had been his home for 3 days, stretched his aching back, and went to wake her parents with the news that their daughter was going to live. The joy on their faces was worth every minute of lost sleep, every ache in his tired body. Josephine's mother wept openly, clutching Russell's hands and thanking him over and over until he gently extricated himself and insisted they let their daughter rest. They agreed, though her mother insisted on sitting with Josephine through the remainder of the night, and Russell finally allowed himself to collapse into his own bed. He slept for 12 hours straight, a deep, dreamless sleep of utter exhaustion. And when he woke the following afternoon, he felt like a new man. He washed and shaved, changed into clean clothes, and emerged from his room to find Josephine's father making coffee in the kitchen. "She asked for you this morning," the older man said with a knowing smile. "Wanted to thank you properly," she said. "Her mother is with her now, helping her take some broth." Russell poured himself a cup of coffee and tried to ignore the way his pulse quickened at the thought of seeing Josephine awake and aware. He told himself it was simply relief that she had survived, gratitude that his efforts had not been in vain, but he knew he was lying to himself. Something had happened during those 3 days and nights, something that had nothing to do with medicine or duty and everything to do with the inexplicable ways that hearts recognize each other, even when minds have not yet caught up. He finished his coffee and knocked softly on the door to the spare room. Josephine's mother opened it and smiled at him warmly. "Come in, Mr. Palmer. Someone has been very anxious to speak with you." Josephine was propped up on pillows, looking pale and weak, but infinitely better than she had 3 days earlier. Her dark hair had been brushed and braided, and she wore a clean nightgown that her mother must have retrieved from their wagon. When she saw Russell, her face lit up with a smile that made his heart skip several beats in rapid succession. "Mr. Palmer," she said, her voice still rough but stronger than it had been the night before, "I owe you my life." Russell stood awkwardly in the doorway, suddenly uncertain what to do with his hands. "You owe me nothing, Miss Wade. I am just glad to see you recovering." "Please sit," she said, gesturing to the chair he had occupied for so long. "I promise I am much better company when I am not hallucinating and burning up with fever." He sat, and her mother excused herself with the transparent excuse of needing to check on something in the kitchen. When they were alone, Josephine reached out and took Russell's hand in hers. Her grip was weak, but her eyes were steady and full of an emotion he was afraid to name. "I remember pieces of the last few days," she said softly. "Fragments, like a dream that you cannot quite hold on to when you wake. But I remember your voice, talking to me in the darkness, telling me to hold on, that I was not alone. I remember the feeling of cool water on my forehead, your hands so gentle despite their roughness. And I remember thinking, even in my delirium, that I did not want to die without knowing the name of the man who cared for me with such tenderness." Russell swallowed hard, his throat suddenly tight. "Your mother told me about you while you were sick, about your teaching, your dreams of opening a school. The world would have been poorer for losing someone with such aspirations." "My mother talks too much," Josephine said with a weak laugh. "But I am glad she told you. I would like to tell you more myself, when I am strong enough to string more than 2 sentences together without feeling exhausted. And I would like to hear about you, Russell Palmer, the man who builds 2-bedroom houses for himself alone and knows how to nurse fevered strangers back from the brink of death." "That might take some time," Russell said, surprised to find himself smiling. "I am not much of a talker under normal circumstances." "Then it is fortunate that I will need several weeks to fully recover," Josephine replied. "You will not be able to get rid of me that easily." The words were light and teasing, but something in her eyes suggested she meant them more seriously than her tone indicated. Russell found himself hoping that she did. The thought of her leaving, of her family loading back into their wagon and continuing west, filled him with a dread that was entirely disproportionate to the short time he had known her. Over the following days, Josephine grew steadily stronger. She graduated from broth to solid foods, from lying in bed to sitting up for increasing periods of time, and finally to taking short walks around the house with Russell or her mother supporting her. Throughout her recovery, Russell found himself spending more and more time in her company, drawn to her intelligence and humor, and the way she seemed genuinely interested in hearing about his life. They talked about everything and nothing. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about the students she had taught in a one-room schoolhouse, about her love of books and her dream of one day writing one herself. He told her about learning the cowboy trade from his father before the drink had taken him, about building his home in Ordway, about the quiet satisfaction he found in working with his hands and watching the seasons change over the Colorado plains. Her parents watched these conversations with knowing looks, but said nothing, though Russell caught her mother smiling more than once when she thought no one was looking. They had made arrangements to stay at the boarding house in town, but spent their days at Russell's home, helping with Josephine's care and gradually beginning to make plans for their future in Colorado. 2 weeks after the fever had broken, Josephine was well enough to sit outside on Russell's small porch in the evening, wrapped in a shawl against the cooling air. Russell sat beside her, both of them watching the sun set over the distant mountains in the comfortable silence. They had reached that point in their growing friendship where silence was no longer awkward, but rather a shared appreciation for the moment. "I have been thinking," Josephine said eventually, breaking the quiet, "about what you said to me during the fever. I was not entirely unconscious, I think, during some of those moments. I remember you telling me that you had let go of the hope for a family, that you had forgotten what it felt like to care about something beyond survival." Russell felt his face grow warm. He had forgotten about those rambling confessions made to what he had thought was an unconscious listener. "You should not put much stock in the words of an exhausted man keeping vigil. Exhaustion makes fools of us all. Or perhaps it makes us honest," Josephine said. She turned to look at him, her eyes serious. "I have been thinking about hope lately as well, about how quickly it can be stripped away. I was so excited about this journey west, about all the possibilities that lay ahead. And then the fever came, and I thought I was going to die without ever having truly lived, without ever experiencing the things I had dreamed about." "You have your whole life ahead of you now," Russell said. "You will have time for all those dreams and more." "Will I?" Josephine asked softly. "My parents want to continue west in another week or so, once they are certain I am fully recovered. They plan to settle somewhere near the mining towns, where my father thinks there will be opportunity for a ranch and I can open my school. It is everything we planned, everything I said I wanted. But lately, I find myself wondering if what I thought I wanted has changed." Russell's heart began to race, but he forced himself to speak calmly. "Changed how?" Josephine was quiet for a long moment, seeming to gather her courage. "Russell, I know it has only been 2 weeks. I know that any rational person would say I am being foolish, that what I am feeling is simply gratitude for saving my life or some kind of confusion brought on by the fever. But I have always trusted my instincts, and my instincts are telling me that you are someone I do not want to walk away from." Russell turned to face her fully, hardly daring to breathe. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that somewhere between the fever dreams and these past weeks of recovery, I have come to care for you deeply. I am saying that when I think about my future now, you are in it. And I am saying that if you feel even a fraction of what I am feeling, I would like to stay in Ordway. I would like to get to know you better, to see if this connection between us is as real and as strong as I believe it to be." The hope that bloomed in Russell's chest was almost painful in its intensity. "Josephine, I have been trying not to feel this way, trying to tell myself that you would leave and I would forget, that it was madness to care so much for someone I barely know. But I have failed spectacularly at not caring. Every moment I spend with you makes me care more, not less. I think I started falling for you the moment I saw you fighting that fever, refusing to give up even when death would have been easier." Josephine reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Then ask me to stay. Ask me, and I will." Russell lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture that felt both chaste and impossibly intimate. Stay. Please, stay here in Ordway with me. Stay and let us see where this path leads us. I cannot promise you anything except that I will spend every day trying to be worthy of the gift you are offering. You already are worthy, Josephine said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You proved that when you sat beside me for 3 days and 3 nights, cooling my brow and refusing to let me slip away. You proved it every time you have looked at me with such gentle regard, every time you have listened to my dreams as if they matter, every time you have made me laugh despite my weakness. You do not need to prove anything to me, Russell Palmer. I already know who you are. They sat together on the porch as the stars came out, hands clasped, both of them marveling at how quickly life could change. 3 weeks earlier, they had been strangers, their paths never meant to cross. Now they were something more, something precious and fragile and full of promise. Telling her parents was more difficult than either of them had anticipated. Josephine's father was skeptical, worried that his daughter was making a rash decision based on gratitude rather than genuine affection. Her mother was more understanding, but she too had concerns about how quickly things were moving. You barely know this man, her father said, pacing Russell's small living room, while Josephine sat on the sofa, her jaw set stubbornly. We had plans, Josephine, good plans. A ranch near the mining towns, a school, a future we had all agreed upon. Now you want to throw all of that away for a man you met 2 weeks ago? I am not throwing anything away, Josephine replied evenly. I am choosing a different path than the one we had planned. And yes, I know it seems sudden, but when have I ever been impulsive or foolish? When have I ever made a decision without thinking it through carefully? I am not some flighty girl caught up in romantic notions. I am a grown woman who knows her own mind and heart. Russell, standing in the doorway to the kitchen, spoke up quietly. Mr. Wade, I understand your concerns, and I respect them. If I were in your position, I would feel the same way. But I want you to know that my intentions toward your daughter are entirely honorable. I am not asking her to stay with me right away. I am asking for the chance to court her properly, to give both of us time to be certain of our feelings. I have a good trade, a home, and enough savings to support a family when the time comes. I am not rich, but I am stable and hardworking, and I care for your daughter more than I thought it was possible to care for anyone. Josephine's mother placed a hand on her husband's arm. Joseph, look at them. Really look at them. I have not seen our daughter's eyes light up like that since before we left Missouri. And Mr. Palmer, for all his quiet ways, cannot hide how he feels about her. Would you really take that away from her? Would you force her to leave when her heart is telling her to stay? Joseph Wade looked at his daughter for a long moment, then at Russell, then back to his daughter. Finally, he sighed heavily. I am a protective father, Josephine. It is my job to worry. But you are right that you have never been foolish or impulsive. If you truly believe this is the right decision, then I will support it. But, he said, pointing a finger at Russell, you heard her, young man, and you will answer to me. Clear? Crystal clear, sir, Russell said, relief washing over him. I would expect nothing less. It was decided that Josephine's parents would continue with their original plans to head west, but they would wait another 2 weeks to be certain Josephine was fully recovered and to give her time to settle into her new life in Ordway. They arranged for Josephine to stay at the boarding house, maintaining propriety while she and Russell courted, though Russell noticed that the older woman who ran the establishment was remarkably lax about allowing Russell to visit at any hour. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Russell's life. He courted Josephine with an intensity and dedication that surprised even him, bringing her wildflowers picked from the prairie, taking her on slow walks through town as her strength returned, introducing her to neighbors and shopkeepers who would become part of her new community. They talked endlessly, discovering shared values and complementary differences, learning the rhythms of each other's thoughts and the contours of each other's dreams. Josephine began making plans for her school, visiting the town council to discuss the possibility of establishing a proper educational facility in Ordway. The town had grown rapidly in recent years with the expansion of the railroad, and there were enough children to justify a real school rather than the informal arrangements that currently passed for education. The council was enthusiastic about the idea, particularly when they learned that Josephine had training and experience as a teacher. Russell helped her scout potential locations for the school, and they spent hours discussing what she would teach and how she would organize the classes. Watching her excitement grow as her dream took shape filled Russell with a joy he had not known he was capable of feeling. This was what it meant to truly care for someone, he realized, to take genuine pleasure in their happiness, to want to help them achieve their goals, not for any benefit to himself, but simply because seeing them thrive made his own world brighter. When the day came for Josephine's parents to depart, there were tears on both sides. Her mother held her tight and whispered advice about marriage and men that made Josephine blush, while her father pulled Russell aside for one final conversation. "I am trusting you with the most precious thing in my life," he said gruffly. "Do not make me regret it. I will spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of that trust," Russell promised. They stood on the main street of Ordway and waved as the wagon pulled away, heading west toward the mountains and whatever future awaited beyond them. Josephine leaned against Russell, letting him support her, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders, holding her close. "Are you sad?" he asked quietly. "A little," she admitted, "but mostly I am excited. Is that terrible of me?" "Not at all. It means you are certain of your choice." "I am," Josephine said, turning to look up at him, "more certain than I have ever been about anything." Russell married Josephine on a crisp October morning in 1882, with half the town of Ordway in attendance and a traveling preacher officiating. She wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair, and Russell wore his best suit, purchased specifically for the occasion. When the preacher asked if he would take this woman to be his lawfully wedded wife, Russell's voice rang clear and strong with his, "I do." And when Josephine made the same promise, her eyes never left his face, her love evident for all to see. They moved into Russell's house together, and Josephine immediately began making it into a home. She hung curtains, planted a garden, filled the shelves with books she ordered from Denver. Russell expanded the house that winter, adding a room that could serve as Josephine's study, where she prepared her lessons and graded her students' work. By spring, the town had allocated funds and lumber for a proper schoolhouse, and Russell joined the other men in town in constructing it, taking pride in every nail he drove, knowing that his wife would teach there. The school opened in the summer of 1883, with 15 students ranging in age from 6 to 14. Josephine threw herself into teaching with a passion that inspired her students and earned the respect of their parents. Russell would often stop by during the day on some pretext or another, really just wanting to catch a glimpse of his wife in her element, commanding the attention of a room full of children with her intelligence and warmth. Their first year of marriage was not without its challenges. They were still learning each other's habits and preferences, still negotiating the small compromises that any marriage requires. Russell had lived alone for so long that having someone else in his space took adjustment, while Josephine sometimes chafed at the limitations placed on women in frontier society, even as she worked to carve out her own place within them. But they faced these challenges together, with honesty and humor, and a fundamental commitment to making their partnership work. On a warm evening in August of 1883, Josephine told Russell that she was pregnant. They were sitting on the porch they had expanded that spring, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, when she took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "There is someone new I would like you to meet," she said with a smile, "though you will have to wait until February or March to make their acquaintance properly." Russell stared at her for a long moment as the words sank in, then pulled her into his arms and held her tight, overwhelmed by emotions too big for words. A child. They were going to have a child. The dream he had given up on years ago was not only coming true, but exceeding anything he could have imagined. "Are you happy?" Josephine asked, though his reaction had already answered the question. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Russell managed, his voice thick. "You have given me everything, Josephine. A home, a purpose, a reason to hope again. And now this. How did I get so lucky?" "We both got lucky," Josephine corrected gently. "The day my wagon rolled into Ordway and you decided to help a stranger burning with fever, that was the day both of our lives changed for the better." Their son was born on a cold February morning in 1884, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his arrival to the entire household. Russell, who had been pacing nervously outside the bedroom while the midwife attended to Josephine, rushed in at the sound and found his wife exhausted but radiant, holding a red-faced infant wrapped in blankets. "Meet Robert Joseph Palmer," Josephine said, smiling up at Russell through happy tears. "I thought we could name him after both our fathers." Russell sat on the edge of the bed and carefully took his son in his arms, marveling at how something so small and fragile could inspire such fierce love. Robert opened his eyes briefly, unfocused and dark, then closed them again and settled into sleep with the complete trust of the very young. "Hello, Robert," Russell whispered. "Welcome to the world. I promise to do my best by you." Josephine reached out and touched Russell's face gently. "You will be a wonderful father. I knew that the moment I saw how you cared for me when I was sick. You have such capacity for tenderness, even when you try to hide it behind that stoic cowboy exterior." Fatherhood transformed Russell in ways he had not anticipated. He found himself working harder than ever to ensure his family was provided for, taking on extra jobs when they were available, building furniture for their home during the long winter evenings. But he also learned to balance work with presence, making time each day to help Josephine with the baby, to sit with her in the evenings and talk about their days, to maintain the connection that had formed between them so unexpectedly. Josephine returned to teaching when Robert was 6 months old, bringing the baby to school with her, and setting up a small crib in the corner of the schoolhouse where he could nap while she taught. The students were delighted to have a baby in their classroom, and the older girls competed for the privilege of helping care for him during breaks. Russell modified his work schedule so he could check in during the day, and the sight of him walking into the schoolhouse to find his wife teaching and his son gurgling happily in his crib never failed to fill him with profound gratitude. The years flowed by, marked by the steady rhythm of seasons and the milestones of family life. Robert grew from infant to toddler to a bright-eyed boy who loved nothing more than following his father around and asking endless questions about how things worked. In 1886, Josephine gave birth to a daughter they named Rebecca Marie, who inherited her mother's dark hair and her father's quiet intensity. 2 years later came another son, Raymond Thomas, who arrived during a spring thunderstorm and seemed to carry that stormy energy with him throughout his childhood. The house that Russell had built for himself alone now rang with the sounds of family, children's laughter, Josephine singing as she cooked, the controlled chaos of bedtime routines and Sunday dinners. He expanded the house twice more, adding bedrooms and a proper dining area, and each addition felt like a celebration of how far he had come from the lonely man who had watched a fevered young woman be carried into his home all those years ago. Josephine's school thrived and grew, eventually requiring a second teacher to handle the increasing number of students. She hired a young woman fresh from Teachers College in Denver, and together they educated a generation of Ordway children, instilling in them a love of learning and the confidence to pursue their own dreams. The town recognized her contributions by naming her principal of the school in 1890, a position she held with pride and dedication for many years to come. Russell's reputation as a skilled craftsman and fair businessman grew as well. He expanded beyond shoeing horses to general metalwork and carpentry, training apprentices and earning enough to provide well for his growing family. But he never forgot the lesson he had learned the day Josephine rolled into town, that success meant nothing if you did not have someone to share it with, that true wealth was measured in love and connection rather than dollars and property. On a summer evening in 1895, Russell and Josephine sat on their porch watching their 3 children play in the yard. Robert, now 11, was teaching 6-year-old Raymond how to throw a ball, while Rebecca, 9 years old and already showing signs of her mother's fierce intelligence, read a book in the shade of the oak tree Russell had planted the year they married. "Do you ever think about that day?" Josephine asked, taking Russell's hand in hers. "The day I arrived in Ordway, more dead than alive?" "Every day," Russell admitted. "Not in detail anymore, but the memory is always there, shaping everything that has come after. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had not heard the commotion, if I had stayed at the livery and minded my own business. The thought terrifies me." "But you did hear it, and you did not mind your own business," Josephine said. "You chose to help a stranger, and that choice changed both of our lives, changed our children's lives, even though they did not exist yet. Every choice we make ripples outward in ways we cannot predict." "Do you ever regret staying?" Russell asked, a question he had never quite dared to voice before. "Wonder what your life might have been if you had continued west with your parents." Josephine looked at him with such love and certainty that it took his breath away even after 13 years of marriage. "Not once, not for a single moment. You and these children, this life we have built together, this is everything I ever wanted, even when I did not know it was what I wanted. My parents found their ranch and built their life in the mountains, and I am happy for them. But my life, my real life, began the moment you walked to that wagon and decided I was worth saving." "You were always worth saving," Russell said softly. "I just happened to be the one lucky enough to realize it." As the sun set over Ordway, painting the Colorado sky in familiar shades of orange and gold, Russell reflected on the unexpected paths that life could take. He had thought himself finished with hope and dreams all those years ago, resigned to a life of solitary existence and emotional isolation. Then a young woman burning with fever had been carried into his home, and in caring for her, in fighting to keep her tethered to this world, he had found his own reason to truly live. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joy and challenge, triumph and sorrow. Josephine's parents visited when they could, traveling from their ranch in the mountains to meet their grandchildren and marvel at the life their daughter had built. Russell's relationship with his in-laws deepened over time, Joseph Wade eventually admitting that he had been wrong to doubt Russell's intentions and character. "You have been good to my daughter," he said during one visit, clasping Russell's shoulder with genuine affection. "Better than I had any right to hope for when I left her in this town with a stranger. You have given her the life she deserved." The children grew and developed their own personalities and dreams. Robert proved to have his father's skill with his hands and his mother's quick mind, eventually apprenticing with Russell in the metalworking trade, while also showing interest in engineering. Rebecca inherited her mother's passion for education and announced at age 14 that she intended to go to college and become a teacher like Josephine, a declaration that filled both parents with pride, even as they worried about sending their daughter so far from home. Raymond, the youngest and most adventurous, talked constantly about seeing the world beyond Ordway, about riding with cattle drives or prospecting for gold or any number of schemes that made his mother gray prematurely. Through it all, Russell and Josephine remained each other's anchor and support. They weathered economic downturns and harsh winters, illness and injury, the normal trials that test any marriage. But they also celebrated successes large and small, finding joy in watching their children grow, in improving their home and community, in the simple pleasure of sitting together at the end of a long day and sharing the details of their separate worlds. In 1900, on the 18th anniversary of the day Josephine's wagon had rolled into Ordway, Russell planned a surprise for his wife. He closed his workshop early and asked her to take a walk with him, leaving the children in the care of their now teenage son, Robert. They walked through the town that had grown and prospered around them, past the school that Josephine had built into a source of community pride, past the church where they had married, past the boarding house where Josephine had stayed during their courtship. Finally, they arrived at Russell's house, though it was no longer accurate to call it that. It was their house, their home, filled with 18 years of shared memories and love. Russell led Josephine around to the back, where he had been secretly working on a project for the past 3 months. There, in what had been an empty corner of their property, stood a small gazebo. Russell had built it himself, crafting every joint and post with the same care he had once used to build the house itself. Inside the gazebo was a bench large enough for 2, and hanging from the rafters were lanterns that cast a warm, welcoming glow in the gathering dusk. "I thought we could use a place to sit that was just ours," Russell explained as Josephine stared at his handiwork with tears streaming down her face. "Somewhere we could escape when the children are too loud or life gets too busy. A place to remember who we are to each other beneath all the roles we play as parents and workers and members of this community." Josephine walked into the gazebo and sat on the bench, running her hands over the smooth wood. Russell joined her, and they sat in comfortable silence for a long moment before Josephine spoke. "Do you remember what you said to me during the fever?" she asked. "When you thought I could not hear you?" Russell felt heat rise in his cheeks, even after all these years. "I said a lot of foolish things during those 3 days. You told me not to give up," Josephine said. "You told me to fight, that you would fight beside me. And you told me that you were not going anywhere, that I was not alone. Those words, Russell, they gave me something to hold on to when everything else was darkness and confusion. They were a lifeline pulling me back to this world. I meant every word, Russell said simply. Then and now. I know you did. And I want you to know that every day of these past 18 years has been a gift. Every morning I wake up beside you. Every evening we sit together and talk about our days. Every moment of watching you be a father to our children, all of it is more than I ever dreamed possible during those weeks when we were still strangers learning each other's stories. Russell pulled her close, and they sat together in the gazebo as the stars emerged overhead. 18 years since the fever, 18 years since a cowboy had sat beside a dying woman and cooled her brow with water from a basin, refusing to let her slip away into the darkness. 18 years of building a life together, of choosing each other again and again, of proving that sometimes the most important decision you can make is to care for someone when they need it most. The years rolled on into the new century. Technology and progress transformed the West, bringing automobiles and telephones and electric lights to replace the horses and telegraphs and oil lamps that had defined Russell and Josephine's early years together. Ordway grew from a small frontier town into a thriving community with paved streets and modern amenities. The world beyond Colorado was changing rapidly, with wars and innovations and social movements reshaping society in profound ways. Through it all, Russell and Josephine adapted while holding fast to the values and commitments that had always defined their relationship. They watched their children grow into capable adults and begin building lives of their own. Robert married a local girl and took over Russell's metalworking business, showing talent and innovation that allowed the enterprise to thrive in the modern age. Rebecca attended the Colorado State Normal School and returned to Ordway as a teacher, eventually taking over as principal when Josephine retired in 1912. Raymond, true to his restless nature, spent several years traveling and working various jobs before finally settling down in Denver, where he found success as a builder and contractor. The grandchildren came in due course, filling Russell and Josephine's later years with new joy and new purpose. They were the grandparents who told stories of the Old West, who remembered what it had been like when Ordway was barely more than a cluster of buildings on the plains, who could speak with authority about how much the world had changed and how much human nature remained the same. In 1920, on a warm June afternoon, Russell and Josephine celebrated their 38th wedding anniversary with a party attended by their children, grandchildren, and what seemed like half the population of Ordway. At 64 years old, Russell was still strong and active, though his hair had gone completely gray and his hands showed the signs of decades of hard work. Josephine, at 62, had retired from teaching, but remained active in community affairs, her intelligence and warmth undiminished by age. As the party wound down and their guests departed, Russell and Josephine retreated to the gazebo he had built 20 years earlier. It had weathered well, requiring only minor repairs over the years, and remained their favorite place to sit on summer evenings. 38 years, Josephine mused, leaning against Russell's shoulder. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like yesterday that I woke up in your spare bedroom with no idea where I was or how I had gotten there. The best decision I ever made was taking you in that day, Russell said. Everything good in my life flows from that moment. You, our children, our grandchildren, this community we have been part of, building all of it, traces back to deciding that a stranger's life was worth fighting for. And the best decision I ever made was staying, Josephine replied, choosing you over the safety of continuing with my parents, over the plans we had made, over the fear of the unknown. I chose love, and it has repaid me 1,000-fold. They sat together as the sun set, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built a love that had endured for decades. The fever that had nearly killed Josephine in the summer of 1882 was now just a distant memory, significant only because it had brought them together. The 3 days and nights that Russell had spent cooling her brow and fighting to keep her alive had been transformed from crisis into foundation, the bedrock upon which everything else was built. Russell and Josephine's later years were gentle and peaceful, filled with the quiet satisfactions of a life well lived. They watched Ordway continue to grow and modernize, saw automobiles replace horses on the streets they had walked together for so long, witnessed the world transform in ways they could never have imagined during those early days in the frontier West. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1932, surrounded by 3 generations of family and a community that had come to revere them as living examples of the pioneer spirit that had built Colorado. The local newspaper ran a feature about their love story, focusing on how they had met and how Russell had nursed Josephine through the fever that should have killed her. Young people in Ordway grew up hearing their story, using it as an example of what was possible when 2 people committed fully to each other and to building something lasting. Russell passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1937 at the age of 81. He died as he had lived his later years, with Josephine beside him, holding his hand and whispering words of love and gratitude. The town of Ordway mourned the loss of one of its founding members, and the funeral drew people from across Colorado who had known Russell or been touched by his quiet integrity and craftsmanship. Josephine lived another 5 years, remaining active and engaged despite her grief at losing her partner. She spent her final years documenting the history of Ordway, writing down memories of the early days, and ensuring that future generations would understand the struggles and triumphs of the men and women who had built the town from nothing. She was especially careful to document her own story, wanting her grandchildren and great-grandchildren to understand how she had arrived in Ordway burning with fever, how a cowboy named Russell Palmer had sat beside her for 3 days and nights, cooling her brow and refusing to let her die, and how that act of compassion had blossomed into a love that had sustained them both for more than half a century. She passed away in 1942, at the age of 84, surrounded by family and at peace with a life that had exceeded her wildest dreams. Her last words were, "Tell Russell I am coming," and those who were present swore that she smiled as she spoke them, as if she could already see him waiting for her on the other side. They were buried side by side in the Ordway Cemetery under a simple headstone that read, Russell Palmer, 1856-1937, and Josephine Wade Palmer, 1858-1942. Together, forever. The town held a memorial service that celebrated not just their individual lives, but their partnership. The way they had demonstrated through decades of commitment what it meant to truly love someone. Their descendants continued to thrive in Colorado and beyond, carrying forward the values and legacy that Russell and Josephine had established. The school that Josephine had founded continued to educate children for generations, and the metalworking business that Russell had built and Robert had expanded remained a fixture in Ordway for decades to come. The gazebo Russell had constructed stood for 70 years before finally succumbing to time and weather, but the bench from inside was preserved and placed in the Ordway Historical Museum as a testament to enduring love. The story of how they met became part of local legend, told and retold with embellishments and variations, but always maintaining the core truth. A young woman had arrived in town burning with fever. A cowboy had sat beside her for 3 days and nights, cooling her brow. And from that act of compassion had grown a love story that would inspire generations. It became a reminder that sometimes the most profound connections are forged not in grand romantic gestures, but in quiet acts of care during moments of desperate need. Decades after their deaths, historians researching the settlement of eastern Colorado would discover Josephine's journals and letters, finding in them a detailed account of frontier life and a deeply moving record of a marriage built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and unwavering commitment. Her description of those 3 days of fever, written years after the fact, provided insight into not just her own experience, but Russell's as well, his tireless devotion to a stranger, and his refusal to give up even when death seemed inevitable. The house that Russell had built with his own hands stood for nearly a century before being purchased by the Ordway Historical Society, and converted into a museum dedicated to preserving the town's history. Visitors could walk through the rooms where Russell and Josephine had raised their family, see the spare bedroom where Josephine had fought her battle with fever, stand on the porch where they had courted, and later watch their children play. The museum became a popular destination for those interested in frontier history, but also for couples who came seeking inspiration from a love story that had endured every test. In the end, the legacy of Russell Palmer and Josephine Wade was not just in the buildings they had helped construct, or the children they had raised, or the institutions they had founded. It was in the example they had set of what was possible when 2 people chose each other completely, when they committed to building something lasting in a world that was constantly changing, when they remembered that love at its core was not about grand gestures, but about showing up every day and doing the small, essential work of caring for another human being. The fever that had nearly killed Josephine in the summer of 1882 had instead become the crucible that forged a bond strong enough to last a lifetime. The 3 days and nights that Russell had spent cooling her brow, fighting to keep her alive, had demonstrated a capacity for tenderness and commitment that would define the rest of their lives together. And the decision they had both made Russell to care for a dying stranger, Josephine to stay with the man who had saved her, had created something beautiful and enduring in a harsh and unforgiving world. Their story lived on through their descendants and through the community they had helped build, a testament to the simple truth that sometimes the most important thing you can do is choose to care, to fight for someone when they cannot fight for themselves, to refuse to give up even when all hope seems lost. Russell Palmer had sat beside Josephine Wade for 3 days while fever consumed her, cooling her brow with water and will and stubborn determination. And in doing so, he had not just saved her life, but transformed his own, opening himself to a love he had thought impossible and building a legacy that would endure long after both of them had passed into memory and legend.